of House Hangouts on the issue of prevailing wage reform. On today's link, Representative Stephen Bloom from Cumberland County joins us, as does Representative Dan Truitt of Chester County, and Representative Fred Keller from Snyder and Union counties. Also joining us today, Bellefonte Borough Council Vice President Vana Dainty and Patton Township Supervisor Joshua Troxell, all who participated in last week's Labor and Industry Committee hearing in State College. Representative Bloom, you presided over last week's committee hearing. It focused on problems resulting from prevailing wage law. What impressions did you take away from that particular hearing?
Well, thank you, Tom, and I want to thank all the municipal officials and employees that participated and testified at that hearing. It was very enlightening because I have talked from time to time with my local municipal officials here in Cumberland County, and they've informed me that prevailing wage is impacting their ability to get necessary projects done. They simply can't afford to do the projects because of the extra cost that prevailing wage imposes on them and ultimately on the taxpayers. Talking to the municipal officials at the hearing on the public record from Center County and from Clinton County, I found out that the same thing is going on in their part of the state. They talked at great length about the projects they can't do. They simply can't do them. The tax dollars that they have do not stretch far enough to cover the necessary projects because prevailing wage is adding anywhere from 10 to 30% additional costs on top of what would be the competitive price for those projects. So the taxpayers are suffering. They're getting less work done even though they're paying the full amount of their taxes. So it's a real burden not only in my part of the state, but I've learned from the hearing we had last week that it's a burden in the central and northern part of the state as well, and I'm hearing more and more that it's a burden all around the state. So I want to really thank those officials for helping us clarify the magnitude and the scope of the problem that prevailing wage law imposes on our taxpayers.
Ms. Dainty, as a councilwoman from Bellefonte, you testified about the cost of prevailing wage to your community. How does prevailing wage burden your efforts to balance your budgets in Bellefonte?
Basically, there are years when we just cannot do any road repairs or any paving because the money is not in the budget. We have always since 1998 until 2008 paved one street in each ward, which we have 3 of. And in 2008 and 9, we did nothing. 2010, 11, and 12, we did some paving projects. This year, again, we are doing nothing. One of the things we did do with our last budget is we did increase the tax by 1 mil that we hope to be able to set aside for street repairs. And so, you know, it's just sort of ridiculous that you have to burden taxpayers to get their streets repaired.
So previously, you had every year been able to do street maintenance.
Yes, and now we cannot hardly do anything. We have to save up, and if we have other expenses, we just can't afford it.
Representative Truitt, what was your impression of testimony given at the State College hearing and this whole issue of prevailing wage?
It was pretty interesting. I actually had 3 major takeaways from the hearing that we held last week. One was I noticed that opponents to prevailing wage reform don't actually argue against the fact that or dispute the fact that we're paying higher than the actual prevailing wage rates. In fact, they say the reason why we're paying higher wage rates than we should have to pay is because we're not collecting enough data. Well, that's not an argument for not reforming the system. It's kind of proving that there's a problem with the system that we have now and that we need to do something about it. And as I listened to the 2 sides debate the issue, I thought it was fascinating that they use a different set of numbers to make their case. Like at one point we were talking about the fact that a flagger on a tree crew, the rate was $65 an hour, and other folks were saying, well, no, it's considerably lower than that. So sometimes we're talking about the wages that are actually paid to a worker. Then there's the prevailing wage that includes some other compensation components, and then there's the rate that actually gets billed to a municipality. And when you force a contractor to pay prevailing wage rates, it drives up not just the amount of money that they pay out, but the amount of money that they bill our municipalities by a significantly higher percentage. So in one case, the opponents to reform were saying that labor is only 20% of a project cost, and we had other people saying it's closer to 50% of a project cost, is because we're looking at two different sets of numbers. So I think resolving or getting apples to apples comparisons could make a difference in everybody's understanding of the issue. And then the last thing, the biggest takeaway for me, was the fact that I asked a question in the hearing. I said, it seems to me that what the effect of prevailing wage is that we're paying fewer workers a higher hourly rate, and that it has the effect of, in some ways, I think I said, shooting, laborers in the foot, in that because we're paying some a lot more than we probably should, we have fewer people working. And in this economy, when we have high unemployment rates, our goal should be to get as many people working as possible. The testifiers were very clear that the effect of not requiring municipalities to pay prevailing wage rates on some projects wouldn't be simply that some people would be paid less. It means that less projects are taking place. So if they could pay less on a given project, they would just do more projects. So there would be just as much work out there in total dollars for workers, but it would be spread out over more workers. And I think that's a better solution when we have the unemployment rates that we have today.
Mr. Troxell, as a Patton Township supervisor in Center County, you mentioned the tax implications during your testimony, the tax implications of prevailing wage in communities such as yours. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. I think that actually ties in very well with what Representative Truitt was saying, is that this tax implication it can be measured in a number of different ways. And I think opponents that we heard at the hearings focused on the fact that there may not be a tax rebate or a tax decrease, and they really honed in on that fact. But as I tried to point out, and as I would reiterate here, there are different ways to save money in a municipal budget. One way is, if we see a reduction in costs, we pass that savings on in the form of a tax rebate or a lower tax rate for a future year. The other way, though, is to offset future tax increases by getting work done now versus putting it off, by saving money at this particular time so that we can save money over time to prevent those large jumps in tax increases. I think there are a wide variety and number of tools that we can use. And it's very important to remember that any savings in a municipal government budget is a savings to the taxpayer in one way, shape, or form. The only argument is, what form will that tax savings take? And I think that's where local municipal elected officials have to be accountable to their constituents and say, yes, we are doing the best we can, the most we can, as efficiently as we can with the tax dollars that we're collecting from you.
Representative Keller, you've been an advocate of reforming the state's 50-year-old prevailing wage law for some time. Based on the testimony of these hearings, what is your outlook on the problem and potential solutions?
Well, I think it's important to realize that when you're looking at this issue, and we're talking about tax dollars, and something that's very sensitive across the Commonwealth is property taxes. And this is a mandate on our municipalities and our school districts on how they have to manage projects. And I look at this as the first step in property tax relief to the citizens of the Commonwealth. And looking at what we do here, we heard the previous testifiers just today even talking about how municipal governments have to be responsible to the citizens. And I think a lot of times we should look to the municipal governments because they do have a limited budget, limited ways they can collect revenue. And to help them stretch their revenue dollar farther, I think that more and more people are realizing that prevailing wage just places a burden on these municipalities and the ability they have to deliver services to their citizens. So I look at this as quite frankly, mandate relief from the state. And in looking at that, being able to relieve these mandates, I think a lot of people can see, and that's sort of is something that really hits home with people, and they understand that if we take these mandates away from their locally elected officials, they can do much more with the dollars they have. And they particularly don't want the state sticking its nose and telling them how to manage their projects. And quite frankly, I think that's what prevailing wage does. It's a mandate on the local governments and the school districts on how they spend the dollars and who they can hire and what they pay wages. I think one important thing to remember is none of our prevailing wage bills, as far as moving the threshold, says one thing about how or how much a worker gets paid. It simply reduces some of the bureaucracy that goes along with these projects and helps people get more done. So I think, listening to the testimony, understanding that it's actually mandate relief. It's not really tied into, per se, wages, because there are many other things that go into a project when you're talking about prevailing wage projects. There's managing the project. There's the cost associated with keeping time slips and all those other things. When you've got a worker that's supposed to be doing roofing or an electrician, that's what we should be paying them to do, not chase around filling out time slips, so that we know exactly every minute they spend on a particular task. And I think when we get those things out in the open and people understand what a burden this is to their local elected officials, I think we're gaining more support. And, I think the outlook on this is pretty favorable, knowing that people are realizing this is not a political issue, it's a Pennsylvania issue, and it helps taxpayers. And I think that's the important point that we need to continue to drive home to everybody as we debate prevailing wage.
And in all the testimony before the committee, has anyone heard that prevailing wage actually ensures higher quality work in construction?
Actually, if anything,
Tom,
I'm sorry, Representative Bloom?
Tom, prevailing wage does not even address the issue of quality in the construction. Whether the construction is completed under prevailing wage or at any other market rate, the regular building inspections all have to take place. The labor and industry inspections have to take place if it's a project that the state would have any intervention in. So the quality has to be there. That has nothing to do with the prevailing wage, and I've never heard any testimony that would indicate that there's any proof for the concept or the notion that some of the opponents to reform put forth that, oh, you're going to get a low quality project if we don't pay prevailing wage. It's simply an unrelated issue that has no bearing on the need to reform prevailing wage to help out our taxpayers.
If I could jump in on that also, many times on these projects that are $100,000 or $150,000 or $200,000, employees do these jobs one day. If they're reporting to the government job to do a roof, they'll be being paid prevailing wage. Where if they go to someone's home to do a roof, they'll be paying the wage that local area bears. So the same people are doing the work. It's just a matter of paying an inflated wage. The same quality of work gets done for the municipality as it does for the homeowner. It's just a matter of, taking more money from the taxpayer to pay an inflated wage.
Anyone want to check in on that?
I would like to. I think you find that your local people don't bid on the jobs because they don't have the manpower to take care of all the extra paperwork. So if you have locals, you have better control over the quality. As far as I'm concerned, you might get better quality if that was to go away.
Okay.
I would echo that sentiment. I think that you see two things with the prevailing wage. One, it does drive away those local providers, those local construction workers, painters, whatever they may be. And most of those people, the motivation that they have to do a good job is repeat customers or word-of-mouth advertising. So they have a stronger motivation to do a better job if they are just a private company. Whereas someone who is receiving prevailing wage, we heard testimony last week that said that this guarantees a higher skill level in the worker, that you're protecting skilled jobs. The correlation or the implication being that there's a correlation between skilled labor and quality of workmanship. And I would contend quality of workmanship is more a factor of motivation than skill level. If you have a desire, either external or internal, to produce good work, then your work will be of higher quality than someone else. And this is really the essence of the debate, because as township officials, we are looking for quality workmanship, effective, efficient, cost-effective projects that can be done, high quality at low cost. And so we need to have some way of measuring the motivation of the worker, which many times is more prevalent in the private sector.
A couple of the supporters of existing prevailing wage laws seem to indicate that problems the law could be corrected merely by contractors reporting wages when it's not required by the prevailing wage law, presumably when projects fall below the $25,000 threshold at which the law kicks in. Do any of you think this problem can be solved with additional paperwork?
No.
No.
Additional paperwork is, once again, going to keep your local people out because they're not going to have someone to sit there and be filling out that paperwork that is needed. And it's just another mandate that you're putting on the private sector and the public.
And I find it hard to believe that the data that we would need to accurately calculate prevailing wage rates isn't already in the hands of government at some level, that we don't need to add additional requirements for local government or for small contractors to be collecting data and submitting it to the state. We probably have it in some other department, whether it's the Department of Revenue or even the Department of Labor and Industry already. I think that data's got to be there.
And Tom, it's really important to note that this whole dispute about how the data is collected so the government can set the right rate for the wages, it speaks to the very problem with the whole prevailing wage law, because the marketplace is the only efficient provider of the actual cost of doing any type of project. The taxpayers are always going to be looking for the most efficient use of their taxpayer dollars. That's what the marketplace does when we set up projects for competitive bidding. It would literally be a crime in many cases if the government was picking and choosing certain friends that they would do. They would have government projects done and they would pay extra to those friends to do the projects. But in the case of prevailing wage, that's really what we're doing to the taxpayers of the Commonwealth. We're saying for certain types of work, you're going to have to pay extra above and beyond what the efficient marketplace wage would be. So simply adding more bureaucracy to fix a broken bureaucracy is not the answer.
And Representative Bloom makes an interesting point. Now, if two businesses get together in the private sector and try to fix prices, that's considered a crime, and yet we're encouraging contractors to do that through labor rates, through the prevailing wage rate, and when it comes to public projects.
Now, the committee is continuing these hearings on prevailing wage until mid-September. Let us ask those of you who are members of the committee, what are your expectations going further? What would you like to hear from in those committee meetings?
I'm hoping that the next three hearings won't just be a repeat of the one that we already have, where the same questions are asked and we get the same answers. I'm hoping that based on the outcome of the first hearing, we can drive a little deeper in some areas, in particular the numbers. I'd love to dig into the numbers a little bit deeper and get an understanding of why one side says one thing and one side interprets the numbers another way. That's what I'm hoping to see at the next three hearings.
Another important thing we want to see at the hearings is educating the taxpayers around the state. This is an issue that's kind of hard sometimes for folks to understand. They're not sure exactly what this means, prevailing wage. And really, as taxpayers understand it better, they will rightfully be outraged that we have a law that says they have to pay extra for the same work. So it's going to help to continue to educate. We hope that the press continues to be involved and cover these hearings so that taxpayers all across Pennsylvania can be better educated on why we need reform on this issue.
Yeah, I think it's important to also, as already been said, to let the taxpayers know more about it. But I would also like to see some contractors that maybe can give a comparison to where they work in other states that don't have the prevailing wage jobs. You know, and what is the experience with the quality of work and the amount of work they can get done in another state where they don't have to deal with some of the prevailing wage bureaucracy we have to deal with here in Pennsylvania. If we're all about fixing the solution and finding out what's best, why don't we look to a state that doesn't force these mandates on our municipalities and actually have some of those people be giving testimony to help us, or to help show our public that it does work to let the private sector set the rates, and you know, that's not government's job. Government's job is to deliver services that are government's responsibility, which is infrastructure and so on. But it's not our responsibility to be telling people what to charge just because it is a government project. We don't do that when we go to a chef. There's no prevailing wage for a chef or any other kind of industry, and it just baffles me that we have to have it when we're counting on the taxpayers to pick up the tab.
Thank you, Representative Keller, and also Representatives Bloom and Truitt. And special thanks to Bellefonte Borough Council Vice President Vana Dainty and Patton Township Supervisor Josh Troxell. We thank you all for viewing, and if you tuned in late, you can watch this Google House Hangout at www.fixprevailingwage.com. Thanks again, all of you, for joining us. Have a good day.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
you.
Thank you.